Rachel Hallote, professor of history at Purchase College, SUNY. So, I had a hard time framing this paper. I thought it was going to be about the issues of terminology for ancient Israel and subregions and subchronological periods. I thought it was going to be about figuring out what we mean when we say a canon of Israel or Canaan and Israel or Israel and Judah or Philistia or Syria-Palestine or the southern Levant, and how there are slightly different canons for each one of those. And it is partly about all that, and I'll come back to it a little at the end, but the more I tried to put this together, the more I realized that it wasn't the main thrust at all. Rather, the main issue with testing the canon of this region is about how the region was perceived by scholars over a century ago, when the canon of the Near East was just coalescing. The canon for this region was defined based on 19th and early 20th century assumptions that have never fully been overcome. In this paper, I'll examine the history of how the canon of this region was formed over the past century of scholarship, why various groups of scholars presented it in the ways that they did, and why these now entrenched presentations may or may not be helpful to the future of the discipline. So let's begin with the elephant in the room. It's a small elephant. This region, by any name, has never been known for its art when compared to the neighboring cultures of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. It doesn't compete. The relative dearth of objects has often been explained by citing the small-scale nature of the southern Levant compared to its neighbors. It consists of many small subregions scattered in small valleys and divided by small mountain ranges, leading to small-scale polities, small populations, and tells that are smaller than the great mounds of Mesopotamia and Syria. Smaller scale art and less art. So let's keep that in mind for the moment. In contrast, when archaeology first got underway in Iraq and Egypt over a century ago, excavators found monumental artworks and architecture immediately. Statuary and reliefs were large-scale and consistently stylized in never-before-seen ways. This allowed for an immediate formation of a canon for each of these lands. To be sure, questions arose about the artistic integrity of these pieces as compared to classical sculpture. When Layard first presented Assyrian sculptures at the British Museum, he pointed to their artistic deficiencies himself, saying that they were undoubtedly inferior to the most secondary works of Greece or Rome. He was echoed by Ralston, who said that the Nineveh marbles are not valuable as works of art, and that the viewer cannot derive pleasure from looking at them. But while their artistic value was questioned, the fact that they defined a unified artistic style was clear. An immediate canon was born. The standard was set for Near Eastern art. This is why, when biblical archaeology first got going in the last decades of the 19th century, expectations regarding artifacts were already skewed towards the monumental. But to the disappointment of many, Palestine defied these expectations. Its small-scale mounds yielded very little in the way of monumental architecture or works of art. The early excavators of Palestine were the first to really encounter the small-scale nature of the country in a meaningful way. Of course, there were palaces and temples and fortresses there, but none on the scale of Egypt or Iraq. Frustration with the scale of the finds is evident in the words of several excavators of those years. Sir Flinders Petrie left Palestine in disgust after only 6 weeks of work at Tel el-Hesi, where he found nothing he considered valuable, and retreated back to the richness of the Giza cemetery, refusing to come back to Palestine for 40 years. He was followed at Hesi by Frederick Bliss, who shared Petrie's disgust, writing that, "This Tell is a fraud. Hardly anything has turned up. Just going to take a cup of tea before returning to the old Tell? I hope it'll give me occasion to speak better of it before long." Similarly, when David Gordon Lyon of Harvard began to excavate Samaria, his financial sponsor, Jacob Schiff, had to save face as soon as the excavations began. Schiff wrote, "I felt, before we started, that the results would likely be to some extent disappointing. I feared nothing of great moment would be found." These frustrations with the nature of the material were compounded by the structure of the emerging academy. In spite of not being up to Greco-Roman artistic styles, the Mesopotamian corpus had a distinct, unique style, as did the Egyptian corpus, and both eventually became integrated into art history and classical studies departments. But Southern Levantine material was never integrated. The main reason for this was the legacy of Frederick Delitzsch and the Babel-Bibel controversy. Delitzsch, an Assyriologist who taught first in Leipzig and later in Berlin, famously contended that biblical narratives were merely inferior, late retellings of the great tales of Babylonian literature. The main thrust of his argument decentralized the Bible and the ancient Israelites by downplaying their significance and influence on Christianity and the West in favor of Babylonian influence. The lack of centrality of biblical culture and the concomitant lack of significance of the biblical Israelites as proto-Jews has often been cited as an anti-Semitic trope in the scholarship of these years. The Babylonians were important and the Israelites weren't. Delitzsch's ideas spread swiftly from Germany to the rest of Europe and America at the turn of the century. The presumed lack of influence of the region, that is, the lack of influence of the Jews and their Old Testament, was partly why the archaeology of Palestine remained on the sidelines for so long, studied in seminaries as part of biblical studies, but seldom given equal footing within the great universities until deep in the 20th century. This attitude, combined with the dearth of monumental-sized finds, kept the discipline from being taken seriously within the emerging academy. This de-emphasis all but obliterated the material culture of the area from the canon of ancient Near Eastern art. So, let's take a look at how this manifested itself by turning our attention to some of the best-known compendia of Near Eastern art, volumes that came to represent the canon of the ancient Near East. I'll limit this discussion to the work of three scholars, Henry Frankfurt, Seton Lloyd, and Pierre Amier. I've chosen these because they were and are particularly influential, often used in classrooms and seminars. This is how the canon becomes the canon, by transmission of knowledge of what is considered important to the next generation of scholars. Let's begin with Frankfurt. Frankfurt, whose fieldwork took him to both Egypt and Iraq, published The Art and Architecture of the Ancient Orient in 1954, soon before his death. Part one of his volume presents Mesopotamian art and architecture from prehistory through the Neo-Babylonian period. Then, part two of his volume is titled The Peripheral Regions. This in itself is a good description of how scholars thought of the status of the Levant, peripheral to the real canon. Within part two, chapter 10 is called The Levant in the Second Millennium BC. This includes a lot of material from the northern Levant, from sites such as Byblos, Ras Shamra, and Al-Alach. But from the southern Levant, we have only a few Megiddo ivories and the gold foil statuette, also from Megiddo, and that's all. Just as striking is chapter 11, which is pointedly about Syria in the Iron Age, and includes nothing from Iron Age Israel at all. For Frankfurt, clearly the artistically valid canon of Israel was very small indeed. We'll turn next to Seton Lloyd. Like Frankfurt, and often with him, Lloyd worked in both Egypt and Iraq, as well as Turkey, and first published The Art of the Ancient Near East in 1961. In it, he fully represents the art of Syria and Lebanon alongside that of Egypt and Mesopotamia, including paintings from Mari, materials from Ras Shamra and Minet el Beida, and other places. But the only artistic contribution from the entire southern Levant is a single Megiddo ivory, the winged griffin. Again, the southern Levant is all but excluded from the canon of ancient Near Eastern art. Pierre Amier, whose work concentrates on Elam as well as Mesopotamia, published The Art of the Ancient World, first in French, in 1977. In the second part of the volume, titled The Image as Document, he included a significant amount of southern Levantine Chalcolithic art, the Gilat woman, the ram with churns, some Beersheba figures, the Nachal Mishmar horde, and an ossuary. But after the Chalcolithic material, he does not include any artifacts from the southern Levant at all, although architectural plans of the Bronze and Iron Age sites of Beit Shan, Chatzor, Lachish, and Megiddo are all present. Following the lead of the earlier compendia, Amier also all but leaves out the southern Levant. But Amier does include two other objects, which bring us to another problem with this canon. Amier, as well as other scholars, chose to include images of the Black Obelisk and portions of the Lachish reliefs, both of which depict rulers or cities from Israel or Judah, but both of which are objects that come from Assyria. These items are almost always published when looking at material culture for ancient Israel, as are two other pieces, the Beni Hassan tomb painting and the Medinet Habu Ramses III Sea Peoples reliefs, both of which depict residents of Canaan and both of which come from Egypt. Thus, the southern Levant's minuscule canon bulges unnecessarily with images that are not from the region at all, but from Mesopotamia and Egypt instead. That sums up how scholars of the art of the Near East have traditionally represented the canon of Canaan Israel, a perspective that is often passed down the generations of students. The canon is all but non-existent, and the most notable pieces are not even from the region itself. Now, let's compare this to the perspective of other scholars, to the perspective of archaeologists who actually excavate in the southern Levant. Was the local perception of the canon different? Did local scholars include more? We will approach the answer by assessing some broad archaeology survey books, volumes put together by some of the best-known, best-remembered scholars in the field. Again, I'll have to pick and choose, and I'm leaving off Albright and Wright's volumes, as they included more verbal descriptions of architecture and ceramics than images of objects, which is an interesting discussion for another time. I'll begin with Kathleen Kenyon, whose Archaeology in the Holy Land was published in 1960. Like her predecessors Albright and Wright, Kenyon included surprisingly few images of the objects. But the very scarcity of the images in this extremely well-known volume made those that she did choose instant mainstays. Besides ceramics and weapons, she published a Jericho skull, as well as other objects from Jericho, Nachal Mishmar material, Chatzor standing stones, several Megiddo ivories, a Philistine coffin, and some ivories from Samaria, not shown in the slides. These are some of the objects that are still considered canonical for the art and archaeology of Canaan today. Another very well-known and often used volume was Yochanan Aharoni's The Archaeology of the Land of Israel, first published posthumously in 1978, 2 years after Aharoni's death. The volume was compiled from Aharoni's notes by his wife, Miriam Aharoni, who presumably made decisions about which objects to include in the plates. This became an influential volume that introduced several generations of students to the archaeology of the region. The items in Aharoni are an interesting mix. The Tel Poleg fish, the Dan charioteer vase, the bronze snake from Timnah, the Nahariya mold, Judean pillar figurines, the Beersheba four-horned altar, and Ramat Rachel pillar capitals. Some of these are better known than others. That is, some didn't stick as part of the canon, such as perhaps the snake. Then, for reasons that are beyond the scope of this paper, there was a gap of over a decade when no updated handbooks or textbooks were published. This ended in 1990 when Amichai Mazar's The Archaeology of the Land of the Bible first came out, and several other texts soon joined it, edited volumes by Amnon Bentor and Tom Levy, among others. Mazar selected many objects that were already well known from preliminary and final excavation reports, but that had never yet been gathered together in a proper compendium, even though we're up to the late 20th century. In the lack of gathering until this point, I contend that we're still seeing the residue of the Babel-Bibel controversy. This region had become known in ancient Near Eastern scholarship for its tight ceramic typologies and for good techniques of excavating, but until Mazar's book, even the archaeologists who worked in the region themselves hadn't seen fit to gather together and properly present art and artifacts as a unified corpus. In addition to objects already published by Kenyon and Aharoni, Mazar selected the Eina Samia cup, some Philistine bichrome with backwards-facing birds, Ashdoda, the Tanakh cult stand, Kuntillat Adrud drawings, and many other objects, as well as architecture. This volume is still a useful teaching tool for introductory courses. That is, the images in it still represent the canon for many, even though the volume is an archaeology textbook and does not even use color plates. Through tracing how this canon came to be, and in whose eyes it came to be, we've been able to pinpoint some of the problems inherent to this region. The Babel-Bibel dismissal of the region, combined with the small-scale nature of finds from it, led to a canon that was initially all but discounted and was only really created later by archaeologists, not art historians, who viewed it locally, not globally, and not in tandem with the rest of the Near East. So we have a Johnny-come-lately canon made up of materials from tiny subregions, polities that shift and change from the Bronze through the Iron Age, a region whose very name has not yet been pinned down by scholarship, in part due to Babel-Bibel, in part due to the dissolving of the term biblical archaeology, and in part due to minimalist-maximalist debates, which I have not had time to talk about here. In short, when we test the canon of this region, we're actually testing scholars' perceptions of the region, not the objects themselves. And the test demonstrates that the southern Levant is still marginalized within the canon of the Near East as a whole, and is still perceived via outdated assumptions. Perhaps a goal of the next decade can be to take a new empirical look at the material culture of the region, remove the Delitzsch-influenced perception of the area as peripheral, and decide what the corpus really is and should be called. Thank you.